So, April Jennifer Choi, you are a space engineer working at the Kennedy Space Center. You are known for your Guinness World Record skills for whip cracking, and you are an amazing fire performer. Thank you so much for your time. I'm super excited to chat with you today. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I greatly enjoy the invitation to be on the show.
Yeah, of course. So, despite your many talents, today I would love to focus on the Guinness World Records and whip cracking. So, if you could tell me, what got you into whips in the first place?
Um, I've always had an interest in whips. The kind of meld between my worlds was the performance aspect, which was fire performing and circus arts and dance, and then the more technical aspect of my life, which came in from supersonic, compressible flows, fluid dynamics. So those happen to overlap very, very nicely with whips, which enables me to bring in my educational background with my performance capabilities. So then that gave me a lot of knowledge to be able to utilize my strengths from either way to be able to do things such as world records.
Okay. I think it's super cool that you have both sides of this. You have both the artistry and the performance aspect, but you also have the science side and understanding how everything works. Makes you incredibly well rounded.
Thank you.
From the beginning, like what about whips themselves got you interested? Was it, whips are cool? Maybe it was Indiana Jones or, some other story.
No, it's much more nerdy. My master's degree was in compressible flows, specifically. My master's degree itself was in implementation of artificial intelligence for computational fluid dynamics. As a subset for that, what we used to verify our CFD code was specifically looking at shock waves. So compressible flows just basically
Okay.
means you're moving at a high enough velocity that air is changing its density considerably. So compressible. So there's a decent pressure gradient, and those pressure gradients are exacerbated. Well, not exacerbated, but most profound in shock waves. So then I did
Hmm.
my AI research on shock waves and be able to lift. What's called lifting is taking from like a micro scale to like a meso to a macro scale approach to then be able to utilize it in CFD code. So then I had a lot of knowledge around an interest in shockwaves and shockwave development. Then I started doing circus arts. One of the props that I consistently picked up was whips. And then I was like, hey, I'm kind of curious how I can combine the knowledge on two of these, which then kind of got me down this rabbit hole of doing a lot of whip science.
I've been explained, or this has been explained to me many times, so I'm familiar. But if you could explain to the people listening, what exactly is that whip crack and what causes all of that?
The whip crack is the tip of the whip exceeding the sound barrier. So everybody's like, hey, once you get past that roughly 746 miles per hour, depending on the pressure and temperature, etc. But roughly one atmosphere is going to be around 146, 148 miles per hour for the speed of sound. You have an object that's moving, that's generating momentum. It's multiplied the entire moment. So momentum is mass times velocity. So you're initiating a velocity, you're speeding it up just like you would throw a baseball. So then you have a certain amount of momentum. Due to the conservation of momentum, as you throw a whip, the amount of whip that is in motion is decreasing. So therefore, its mass is consistently decreasing. And as the mass goes down, the velocity goes up. Some of that momentum gets lost to things such as drag, air friction, etc., air compression, but that's another thing that's happening. So you have that type. You also have angular versus linear momentum. So you are generating a bit of a loop. You also have relative velocities. So if you do a loop, then you have to go start one direction and you reverse the direction. You have this kind of quick change in direction. So like relative to the initial body, especially you see people kind of pull back on it relative to the initial of a velocity, you're also getting a fairly different velocity, like differential between the two bodies. So that has a greater different velocity differential. And then also you have the loop that's being generated. So if you think about like a car running down the highway never moves and your wheel is not moving relative to the highway in terms of like its contact patch. So the bottom of your tire is always going to be in contact with the road, which means it's zero velocity. And if your car is moving at, say, 30 miles per hour, the top of your wheel is moving at 60 miles per hour because it's a circle, right? You're moving about the axis. So the bottom is zero, middle is 30, top there. So you also have that relative kind of improvement in velocity gains. So all those stacked on each other basically runs down to generating a very, very high velocity. It's moving faster than the speed of sound. Therefore, the shock is getting compressed, or the air is getting compressed in front of it, and then it's generating a bow shock. That bow shock then sheds. You have a very, very sharp pressure gradient, and that's a shock wave front, and that's what people hear.
Yeah.
Yep.
This brings me back to my engineering degree. So I
Yeah,
have a
I
computer
know.
engineering degree. Reminds me of all the physics classes,
Yep,
fluid dynamics.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, fun. Yeah, I really appreciate that explanation. And then whenever I had to explain that to like my friends, I'm like, thing moves real fast, breaks sound
Yeah.
barrier, loud.
It's not
And then
just that it
yeah,
moves really fast because there's a lot of things that go into it to get it to move, not necessarily move faster, but be louder.
there's obviously more. Yeah.
Like for example, we're talking about if you kind of snap the whip back, which I don't recommend people doing as beginners. People always see that. You are able to generate more power, like you hear a towel crack, like a towel snap, because you're moving a pocket of air because there's something called the no slit boundary condition in fluid dynamics. There's essentially things that are directly attached to a body with the body. So like, for example, if you've ever seen a velocity gradient in a pipe flow, the velocity is near zero at the edges of the pipe. And then more as you move toward the center of the pipe, velocity goes up. So you have that, if you remember your fluids. The same thing is if you have a body moving, water, sorry, not water. I was just thinking of a different fluid. Air directly against a like aerodynamic body is going to be the same velocity as that body moving through its air. And then as you get further and further away, you have a velocity profile. So having that reversal of direction is also one of the things that has a relative velocity that increases. So therefore, if air is moving this way and objects moving this way, relative velocity ends up being much higher. And that also helps support being able to create a sharper pressure gradient as you go from ambient to whatever pressure you're generating, in this case, a shock.
Yeah. No, I love it. Thank you for the in-depth explanation. I think physics is really, really cool, and it governs the entire world
Oh,
around
yeah.
us. Um, out of curiosity, so if you can explain the Guinness World Record side of all of this, what was that process like? What made you want to pursue this path, and how did you go and pick the different things that you would qualify for?
When it all started was I started building a kind of a skill set, and one of those skill sets happened to be whip cracking. So I started teaching whip cracking around the United States, and people would ask me questions like, "Do you know why a whip cracks, or how a whip cracks, or did you know it breaks a sound carrier?" Because that seems like the most common question to ask. And then one of them was like, "What's the longest whip ever cracked?" I'm like, "I don't know the answer to this. Let me go Google it real fast." So I looked it up, and then I'm like, "That doesn't seem that far off. Let me see what's the longest whip I have in my collection." So then I'm like, "I think I could crack a longer whip." So then I did a longer whip, and then a longer whip, and then a longer whip, and then at some point, I'm like, "I think this is a record I can break." So then I ended up developing and making fire whips because I thought it'd be really, really cool to put it in like a show as a finale to see this super long fire whip crack.
Yeah.
So the guy got up to like 269 feet, I believe.
Holy shit,
Yeah, it's a
that's a very long
269
whip.
foot fire whip is really, really cool
Yeah.
to see. And
Okay.
then I don't think I got it to crack dry. I did get it to like generate a fireball on fire. So then we shortened it, and then that's when we got a adjudicator to come in to a flow festival. They were a surveyor, so they were able to measure the whip, verify its length. They walk all the way to one side. I walk all the way to the other. I crack it. They can verify that it's indeed a crack, and they heard it all. And then we have to go through all the paperwork. So that was sponsored by an event. So the event filled out the paperwork, and then Guinness ended up giving a reply saying, "Congratulations, you got the world record." So that's kind of how it started because that was the first world record I got from Guinness. Thank
Congratulations.
you.
That's such a cool story.
It was a lot of effort.
Yeah, I can imagine because a lot of I myself included before I did a lot of research on you and the process. I was like, oh, Guinness World Record. I wonder how that works. It has to be more than just a group of people get together. There has to be official representation.
Yes.
Someone has to verify and prove various amounts of data and measurements and all that other stuff. But there's a process behind it.
Oh,
It
yeah.
takes a while. There's a lot of paperwork
hmm
involved.
And there's different record organizations. I have several world records through like Record Setter, through Elite World Records, through online world records. There's different databases, and they all go through different
Mhm.
organizations to verify it. So like some of the whip records required a official whip expert, somebody with like a letterhead to be able to write a letter saying this is indeed breaking it, or an archery expert, or like for cubing world records, they have the WCA, which is the World Cubing Association. For a lot of
Yeah.
the sports, it's usually like the Olympic Association when they break a bunch of records at the Olympics. So it depends on where you go through, and the process looks a little bit different for each one.
Mhm. Okay. So, motivated from your first world record, I guess you started the snowball to go
Yep.
get and accumulate a couple more.
Uh-huh. So now I'm at 21 Guinness World Records as of the beginning of
Jesus
2025.
fuck, that's so many.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Out of the 21, what are some of your favorites and the stories behind them?
Longest is definitely one of my favorites just because it was my first one. It just took a lot of effort. One of the ones I'm most proud of is probably fastest whip. It's the official one is the fastest time to hit 10 targets whip. It was just referred to as fastest whip because like, you're so it's not fast as in like how fast the tip moves, which I'm hopefully going to release a paper soon. So I can't give you too much details on verified the tip velocity, but I can tell you it is significantly higher than just the speed of sound. I can tell you that it's more than 3 times the speed of sound. So it's way faster than people think. And so fastest whip was fastest time to hit 10 targets with a whip. My record setter record for that, I think, is 2.39 seconds. And my Guinness World Record, I
Holy
think,
shit.
was
Okay.
2.54 seconds for 10 targets. Yeah, it's really fast. It took a lot of effort.
That's really
Yeah,
fast.
my
Yeah, okay.
best ever witnessed, unfortunately not on camera, is under 2.2. When we did our warm up, I actually got 2.2, and then I did not get close to that day. So we had timekeepers, we had witnesses, we had everybody there. We're just like, let's run through it so logistically everybody knows what to do. The timekeepers know how to use the
Yeah.
stopwatches, everything. Got 2.2 seconds. Like, oh, that's way better than I thought. And then we ran it like 10 more times and we didn't get close. And we're like, ah, what was the best time we
Yeah.
got today? It was 2.5, so it wasn't quite the 2.3 that I had, for record setter, but it was
Okay.
still enough to make me be a Guinness World Record.
I mean, sometimes you just get a good run and it
Yeah,
just works out really well.
statistical distribution.
Yes, absolutely. How how are the targets arranged in something like that? Because I imagine the target arrangement has a very large impact on the ability to execute that quickly.
Yeah, there's a variety of different targets. So I also have the world records for like most straws, most flowers, most Jenga block had for most Jenga blocks, most eggs, most newspapers. There's just like different targets that require different setups.
Mm,
For ones that a partner is holding, or like really small ones like playing cards, it's a lot more difficult to hit because it's so much more. You need to be so much more accurate. Obviously, Jenga blocks is really, really tiny because you have to go for a single Jenga block. So then each thing has its own difficulty. For fastest whip, it's the cups are 7-ounce cups. So you get to set the cups up and then you have to hit those. While I think one of the
okay.
harder ones is candles because the candle flame is so, so small. Luckily, the way they
Yeah.
have that one set up is you can put it at the height you want and you get enough. I'm going to refer to it as wind. It is a bow shock that is able to pass through that even if you don't get dead on, you can still blow a candle out with a whip decently easy.
AoE.
Yeah. I like
Yeah.
that gamer term AoE.
Right. Area of effect for those who aren't. So for these targets, are they all strung out in a line? Are there some in front of you, some behind you? I imagine, there's different, whipping patterns that you can take to
Yeah.
hit targets more effectively depending on how they're laid out.
All of these, because the rules dictate that they have to be a certain distance,
Got it.
unless you go in a circle, right? In order to maintain that distance, it's easier to set it up in a line. So then it's
Sure.
usually whatever that distance is for that record from that line. So like balloons, I think it was like 2 meters or something. So you have a line drawn out and then a line drawn out for the balloons. So then you're going and aiming toward the balloons.
I imagine all of this takes a insane amount of practice. How do you go about practicing for something like this? What are the foundational skills you need to develop? How do you build up from those building blocks and kind of get to where you are?
I mean, a lot of it is just when you get home from work, you practice whatever you do. So like a lot of the whip cracking ones, you just sitting there cracking a whip. The most recent time I was training for longest whip, which was a record setter record, but it wasn't a Guinness World Record. I gave myself
Yeah.
tendonitis because I was drilling and pushing
Oh.
myself a bit too hard. So you
Okay.
do have to like pace yourself intelligently. It comes down to almost any skill that you have to develop over time. It's just consistent practice. So I have 6 records planned for 2025. I have them all
Okay.
out noted in a sheet that I look through and be like, what's the record I knit? Where am I at? How much do I need to increase? What's kind of a realistic schedule to hit? So from the balance ones, like if it's slackline or a balance board, you're just sitting there to see, okay, can I sustain standing on a balance board or doing something else for 60 seconds? And then I'm training whips separately, and then you'll combine those two to make sure that you can do both of them at the same time.
So yeah, there's very clearly a plan in place. You're approaching this like a world athlete, as you are. Um, I'm super excited to see what you deliver on in 2025. This is so exciting.
Thank you.
Are you able to share any of the records that you're hoping to go for?
I don't want to because of 2 reasons. One,
Sure.
if it breaks early enough in the year, then Guinness World Record might end up doing like a collaborative thing where we take photos and everything. So then those photos are reserved to be published. But when they publish at the end
Ah,
of the year or when they release the book, like in the October timeframe, they want the book to be correct, right? So if you tell people, hey, I'm going to break a world record, say, I don't know, most number of water bottles juggled, right? And you get a certain number, let's just say 30 or most number of I don't know, something where we have a metric
sure.
and you
Yep.
set it, you do the photo shoot, they edit it, they get your layout, your page layout, they put you in there, they put you in the book. Somebody heard about it and then they break it. It's no longer the record when the book is published. So they will have to pull
Right.
out it or they have to redact it. So that's one of the reasons. The other reasons is so that people don't kind of undercut you. There's been a history I'm gonna say a history. Let me rephrase that. There has definitely been situations where people are chasing a record, and one person hears of the other ones, goes in, breaks that record because they're not doing it for an event. So if I'm trying to say break a record for a Renaissance festival, I'm gonna give them a date. I'm gonna give them like all the setup and everything, and there's gonna be a number I need to hit, right? But if someone says, "Oh, I'm gonna go ahead and break that record," and they get it much, much sooner, then all of a sudden that's not going to be a record when that event happens if that wasn't target you were aiming for. So you'd have to like push yourself
Hmm.
extra, especially for like manufacturing style records. It becomes an issue because you might have put a ton of money into be able to develop that. Skill based is not much of an issue, but we've had situations in the past where it's like, oh shoot, this changed last second, but somebody broke this record a month ago.
Okay. No, fascinating answer. And when I asked the question initially, I was curious if there was something like this as an answer behind it,
Yep.
because this gives me insight in how this world works, the various politics at play, the processes, the planning, the
Yeah.
execution. There's so much
Especially
more that is led on.
So I'm not as protective as some others. I know several magicians who are going for world records, and they have to be very because, and some of like the Red Bull world records, like they get insanely pricey. So if there's a multi-million dollar price tag on doing something, you do not want somebody cutting you off early just because of somebody leaking information.
So, moving on from the Guinness World Records, but still keeping the theme of whips, you mentioned you did a bunch of performances for circus and other
Uh-huh.
various, events and arenas. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, that's how we met. There's a lovely person by the name of Drew Bowen who organized a show in Seattle and invited me to MC. So it was wonderful to be able to meet you in person that way. We
Yeah.
have a history of going to festivals and performing at various gigs together, such as like flow shows and whatnot. My big break was the 2012 Indianapolis Super Bowl. I got to perform along Phoenix Fire Productions and
Ooh.
Carenza's Caravan and Super Bowl Village. So that was like given several days to just perform on the streets, kind of hone the craft. And then also, like, once you get the Super Bowl like on your resume, you're then able to use that to help market yourself elsewhere. So then I did small independent performances for either events or like when you get hired for a gig, some type of branding or marketing event for theirs, several television shows, some movie extra positions, etc., that I was able to do. So that kind of blossomed my career as a performer, most of those being with whip cracking.
I'm really glad that you mentioned the momentum aspect, because I did my research before we're chatting today, and I peeped at your portfolio. You are excellent at capitalizing on the opportunities given to you and using that momentum to then go and reach the next tier of stuff. And I
Absolutely.
can see this throughout your history, looking back on the dates and the years. So massive props and respect. It's not easy, and you do such a wonderful job at
Thank
that.
you.
So that performance arena, is there, besides the Super Bowl one that you just mentioned, is there a favorite type of arena like that you like to be in? Would it be Renaissance fairs? Would it be performing for various circus shows? Is there something that calls to you?
They all have different aspects that I enjoy. Like, obviously, broadcasting arts is where you get numbers. Like, you want television and movies, videos, YouTube to like just get to the masses, right? If you want large view counts, TikTok viral videos on YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, that's when you can get into like the 30 million sets of eyeballs getting on you. Obviously, getting paid is really nice. So those are when you want branding deals. So working with certain companies to say, hey, I will be the face on a bottle, or I will be presenting like modeling next to your car, etc., going to a trade show, representing a toy festival or a toy at a toy festival, etc. Those are kind of the ones where it's like I would want a little more green in my pocket. So they have their own kind of set of advantages that I really, really enjoy. And then there's like the technical aspect, because those are more the marketing and visual versus I don't get to hone my craft as tightly as I would like. So when I do things like the International Jugglers Association, I'm doing it for my peers. So I really push myself from a technical aspect from there. So those don't pay super well, but those are when I feel the most self-motivated. Does that make sense? So I have like ones that I use for marketing, ones where I use for skill development, and ones that I use for financial development.
Yeah, that it's amazing because being a performer is so fucking hard, and
Yeah.
that world
Yeah.
and all of that envelops. You don't just get to go to the office from 9 to 5, collect a paycheck, and do this for 40 years. You have to, it's essentially running a small
It
business, but you're in
100%
charge of your
is.
own marketing. Yeah,
I think
yeah.
I used to teach, and I occasionally still teach, like a business for performing artists things to kind of go, here are the aspects that you need to be able to capture. Because there are a lot of people who only focus on, say, the social media aspect, beautiful video, beautiful photos, but they don't do any client outreach. And if you don't do client outreach, you're not getting to the eyeballs that will actually pay you. Like, you will get millions of views with your friends, but not to organizers that are going to give you money. And there are people who are really good at the business aspect, but they don't put their name out there. So they can get like one or two really high paying contracts because they have repeat clients on their like yearly client list. But then they're not growing and doing discovery to get out and reaching out new people, because you want to grow your client database very rapidly. So that's kind of the networking thing. So networking goes into marketing as well as obviously you want to be good at what you do, because if it comes down to, hey, there's 4 or 5 people doing an audition, they're going to pick the best one, if assuming their marketing is fairly equal.
I mean, there are so many different facets. I really like how you broke down how one approach is really helpful for getting this portion of your business working correctly.
Uh-huh.
Um, as a YouTuber and things that I'm hoping to strive for, the advice that I was given is you're going to have different videos to attract different viewerships and serve different purposes.
Absolutely.
One will be like get new eyeballs on your stuff, and that'll be a lot more broad reaching
Mhm.
content. One will be retain the current audience that you have, and then you're going to be speaking to them specifically. Another one will be to, develop your skill set and expertise, try something a little bit new, do something a little bit different, figure out the style and format. So there's all these different levers
Yep.
that you can pull to then affect different aspects of your production, your business, your whatever. excellent advice.
Yeah, business optimization is a thing that's billions of dollars are spent in so many different industries specifically for that.
Yeah, it's what consultants get the buku
Oh
bucks
yeah,
for, right?
exactly.
Very cool. So I know that you have the full-time job at the Kennedy Space
Yeah.
Center, but do you plan on doing any more performances in 2025 outside of the Guinness World Record stuff?
Uh, I do have to take a bit of a pause. I
Sure.
have kind of split myself into a couple of positions with Kennedy Space Center. So I am joined the LSP, which is the Launch Services crew. They provide commercial services to various commercial partners. Um, it would be in the past by the time this airs, but like tonight, there's going to be Eclipse Project, which is a commercial lunar program services. But they're going to be launching a Blue Ghost mission that has 10 NASA science missions on it. So that will already have launched by the time this shows up. So that's kind of the LSP side. And then I'm also on the HLS side, which is Human Lander System. So that's when we're sending humans to the moon. So that includes Artemis, which is like this shirt, this pin. I have a tattoo of the Artemis logo, these two over on this shoulder over here. So we're working with us doing it ourselves, meaning like Artemis 1 is sending just NASA using NASA workforces, as well as working with commercial partners such as SpaceX and Blue Origin to be able to do 2 human landers to be able to put up there. So those are my kind of 2 areas of focus, and my roles are concentrated right now.
Okay, yeah. I mean, seasons of life, right? Like, it's really important to focus on the things that you want to focus on currently and really go all in instead of spreading yourself too thin across a multitude of areas. And honestly, myself included, I tend to fall short when I do that.
Yeah,
So pick one thing, do it really well.
when I started in performing, I really tried to spread out and capture, right? Because I was like, I'm going to do fire. I'm going to do fire eating, fire breathing. I'm going to do dance. I'm going to do instruction. I'm going to do choreography. I'm going to do videos. I'm going to do tutorials. I'm going to do whip cracking. I'm going to do aerials. And it's just like you can't become really, really good trying to do 100 different things. Nobody has like 50 gold Olympic gold medals in a bunch of different sports. It's like they're all their golds are because they're concentrating on one thing. So like for me, it was like, let me go test my fields. Like when they do focus groups for marketing, they're like, okay, let's take, for example, cars. You make a couple of different like starting vehicles to kind of test the projects. And then you're like, oh, turns out we really want to concentrate on electric cars or sports cars or that branding. You get that audience and you focus into that audience. And so for me, that ended up being whips because I got to leverage my engineering background as well as like the network of people I had, right? And like the audiences that I wanted to capture were kind of more into that whip category or found more of that interest.
Yeah.
So then I ended up focusing and honing on that, which then elevated, like, I would say, clout or status, because then I could start rising up as more and more people see that because I'm concentrating my skills in one area. So now that I'm focusing on that, I'm trying to do that as an engineer because beforehand, spreading myself between like industrial, mechanical, and aerospace was a terrible, terrible idea. I'm like, I want to be able to do it all. Like, no, I need to concentrate on one specific thing. So I'm like, okay, and as much as I love mechanical, I'm going to be aerospace, and I'm going to be aerospace for at least a solid year.
I mean, the advice that was always given to me is, hey, Jason, you can do anything you want. However, you cannot do everything you want, so you
Yeah,
need to pick.
100%.
Similar, I can relate to that a little bit because for my photography journey, I'm a photographer by trade. And in the beginning, I did product photography, I did boudoir, I did weddings, I
Yep.
did real estate, I
Yep.
did, maternity.
Yep.
I just, if it involved a camera, I did it.
Yep.
But over time, I realized I just like certain things a lot more than the others. Some things pay a lot better. Some things give me a personal fulfillment. So right now, I'm niching down real hard into just live entertainment. So concerts, performances like flow arts, stuff like that. Just anything that happens live. I enjoy that just much more than any other aspect. So I'm going to focus on that and get really good at that and market myself for that. So get to niche down and rise in that particular area.
I can't wait to see how much your journey grows.
Thank you. That means a lot. I'm super excited. 2025 sounds like big years for us both. I actually had a question on whips and material properties.
Okay.
So, most things can be a whip. they can be made out of a bunch of different stuff.
Yep.
It can be, it could be a chain whip, it can be
Mhm.
plastic, it can be, woven rattan. What are the different properties that you like to play with? Do you have any personal favorites and why?
I would say nylon has just become the most popular, period. It's
Okay.
really easy to get a hold of. Like everyone can get paracord. Leather is expensive, especially rawhide. Rawhide is like considered the best. It would be the Ferrari of whips, right? But it's really hard for
Okay.
most people to get a test drive in a Ferrari. It's not going to happen. While like Toyota and Honda are like the most popular cars in the world, and or at least in the United States, I still believe. Um, and that's because they're durable, they're reliable, they're affordable. Everyone can get to them, easily attainable. Anyone can learn to drive them. Versus like going to get a Maserati like stick shift. Like not many people can drive that, so it's
Yeah.
just it becomes super available. So for me, that 650 flat paracord is available everywhere, and it's super easy to work with. So that's what I end up making most of my whips from.
Okay, very cool. Now, aside from the accessibility, is there a feel component? Is there a how it performs component that you enjoy about it?
I really like it because I like lighter whips. Most people, when they
Okay.
start into whips, I'd say beginners want to go for the power and the sound. So they're going for a bit on the longer side and a bit on the heavier side. The most common ones are like the like 6 foot indie whip or the 8 foot Catwoman whip or the 8 foot oh, I forgot the name of that show. Zorro, that 8 foot Zorro whip, like the ones that
Ah,
are really
yeah.
famous out there, or the 8 foot indie whip. Those are the ones where like they're loud, they're usually leather, they look gorgeous, they're powerful, and that's what beginners round because they just want to make that one loud crack at a time, right? And then eventually, when I started doing world records, was I needed to go for speed, and when you have a large clunky object that is cutting through a large amount of stuff, like when you cut through cans, you can't use leather, like you just can't. It will get it dirty. You'll get sugar on there. It'll just start marring it up. And then anytime you get water on leather, it damages it. It just looks terrible. So it's like I had to move away from leather because also going out to festivals or music festivals performing, just it eventually just kind of became more and more difficult to maintain, as well as for television productions they want something super bright and high contrast to whatever is behind them. And you don't ever want like a light background and a dark point of focus because it's really hard to see the contrast on the person. So generally things like darker backgrounds and lighter highlights. So therefore it's easier to see like a white whip in a dark background or like fire in at night, right? It's just easier to
Yep, yep.
see. You always want to light your subject. And then, so then I ended up using brighter and brighter colors and lighter whips. So it ended up being that like really hot pink neon paracord just because it was visually appealing.
I love this kind of information because this is the type of stuff people never think about,
Yeah.
right?
If you
It's
do one show that's poorly lit, and you get to see your the video from it, and you realize, oh my god, nobody can see anything. As cool as it is to be like black and dark and sultry, there is
grungy,
not a
yeah.
lighting team. No one can see you. So, like, that's also, like, why I moved into, like, LED whips and fire whips for a while before I ended up taking this job was because, okay, it's more important for people to see what you're doing than for you to try and, like, be as sexy as possible. So it's like, okay, I'm gonna start wearing, like, white, bright outfits, bright pink. So my quick change outfits are high contrast because I had, like, quick change outfits that went from, like, pink to red, like, still pretty high contrast, but it was like a darker pink, and then it was like a lighter red, and you couldn't really see that, and now it's like,
Still too
if I do quick
close.
change,
Yeah.
I'm going from black to white and then white to black because I want people to notice. Because otherwise,
Yeah, yeah.
the people don't pick up as the subtleties as you would like, coming from a mentalism and magic background, we really tried to work the subtleties for, like, all the convincers, but I'm learning, like, you really have to be in someone's face. I think it might be that people's attention spans and their focuses are just getting weaker. And because of that, you need to be more in their face with performances. They need to see bigger performances, faster pace, quicker stitches and more obvious changes for it to like really have that grabby attention feel.
No, I've definitely noticed that attention thing with because you the subtlety is lost. You have to kind of beat
Yeah.
them over the head with stuff.
If
In
you
my pictures, I try to do high contrast, bright brights, dark darks, and I feel you.
Yeah,
I
if you've
understand.
noticed like Instagrams, like look at posts from people from like 10 years ago and it's like, that more realistic, subtle color changes. And now everything is very vibrant, high with HDR, the high dynamic resolution. Is that HDR?
Yep,
Okay,
yep, you
so
got it.
like they really want that vibrancy that really grab people's attention. So you're like, whoa. So same thing is like I had to change myself to be bigger contrast, bigger movements, um, and really try to pull the audience in more.
Okay. But yeah, back to the whip thing. So to summarize, it sounds like you prefer nylon for a multitude of reasons. One, the colors, a lot more customization in the aesthetic and the look, maintainability. It's a lot more friendly than leather. You don't
Yep.
have to worry about it getting dirty, getting wet, the things you can hit with it. And you gravitated towards, speed, its performance,
Yep.
the ability to be a lighter material. You can move it around faster.
Mhm.
You can have more finesse and accuracy.
Absolutely.
Okay, very cool. What are some of your favorite places to source your whips, or do you make your own?
For Guinness World Records, they have been shifting their rules to make sure everything is commercially available, especially for skill-based records. Because otherwise, you
Okay.
can essentially just buy a very hyper designed object for whatever record you need, right? Which is like part of one of the reasons I got into it is because I could engineer my way into these records by making them lighter and faster. It's much easier for me to get the number of cracks or the number of targets. So now they're adding in that commercially available rule. So in which case now I'm going to my favorite whip makers out there would be Adam and Dakota Renrich because Adam makes all the top performers whips in the United States. There's a long running joke from LA WhipCon last year where everyone's like, "Who makes your whips?" And they would just point at Adam, who's on the stage, and they're like, "Who makes your whips?" And they would just point at Adam on the stage, and like, "Who makes your whips?" And they point at Adam. They all turned to
Yeah.
Adam, and they're like, "Who makes your?" And his hand's already in there. You're like, okay, yeah, this makes sense. So like all the top performers, they're just Adam Winrich whips. He has the most number of Guinness World Records. I think he has 30 Guinness World Records and 20 of maybe even more than probably like 20 mid 20s are just in whip cracking. So like
Okay.
top end. Um, then Dakota Winrich, his wife makes phenomenal whips that I absolutely love. I think they're a little bit more so what's the word there? Supple.
Supple?
Yeah, because like I feel like there's whip makers, they have a lot of like tension differences between whip makers, and I feel like Dakota's makes it a little bit more slinky, a little softer. So I tend to see this thing where like men, like male whip makers, they tend to have tighter, stiffer whips because I think they're just like they try to muscle everything. While female whip makers, they tend to be a little bit looser, a little bit more flexible. So like my personal whips, I've gotten looser. I started at like normal and then I started tightening my whips because everybody wanted that snappy. And then as I started speeding whips, I started loosening my whips again. So there's like
Okay.
this curve of like the amount of stiffness and the tightness of the braiding. And I'm kind of over in here again. So I'm like lighter, looser, more flexy whips that I really, really like. So that's why I kind of lean toward like my main performance sets are Dakota Winrich rather than the Adam Winrich whips that I have. Christopher Wright from X1 Whips. I've been just talking with him regularly. He just won first place for the synthetic whip for LA WhipCon. So it's like right now, 2025, he has the first place medal for the best synthetic whip in the United States. So like obviously he makes absolutely gorgeous whips. So like my play whips, my juggling whips, those are the ones he made. And he's also making the whips that I have for the upcoming record. So Dakota made a pair of them for a record, and then he's making the whips for the other 5 records.
Okay. So I asked some questions about whip construction. Now that we talked about materials, but like the actual design of the whip. So if you could break down the components of a whip, what would they be?
Okay, I'm gonna do from one end to the other because that's kind of how my design
Perfect.
process ends. The very, very first thing on an Indiana Jones whip, they have a wrist loop. That's like kind of the very first thing that comes in on that. None of my whips have wrist loops. I just don't like them. They just add a little bit more mass, and I don't want that. The next thing that comes in is that it's called a concho. It's just some type of decorative thing that goes on the end of the whip that you can see on there. And then you have a Turk's head, which is that big fancy butt knot. Then inside there, you're going to have a handle core material. So usually it's about 1/4 inch was the standard for a while. Then changed to 6 millimeter just because 6 millimeter is worldwide, while 1/4 inch is specifically America. When Nick's Whip Shop became like the standard for whip making on the internet rather than Ron Edwards or David Morgan's books, then people went to Nick. And then Nick, I believe, is using, I think he's using 3/16. So just a hair thinner, just gives it a little bit more flex. So that's kind of the standard handle material. I really like graphite and carbon fiber. They get kind of expensive, but once again, I want really, really light whips. So I'm using like graphite and carbon fiber. And then that comes out to a core. If you want heavy whips, they're usually lead shot loaded. Um, Due to popularity and availability, people are tending to use BBs. So like that standard 17.7 caliber BB. That's the 4.5 millimeter BBs. Those are kind of what people use, or ball chain for a little lighter. I no longer weight my whips, so I just use straight up paracord. And then they'll wrap it with leather. There'll be a bolster, which is just a piece of leather that goes around it that's not braided. That's to add mass and to kind of distribute how you want it to lay it out. Also smooths the whip because you just layer over and over a braid and you get a knot or a knuckle on top of a knuckle on top of a knuckle. Then that's thicker and then it comes down to here. So like getting that rolled out using a bolster smooths everything. And then you have the belly layers. You can have like triple belly whips or just single bellied whips. And it's the number of braided layers they have up until the overlay. Transition knot usually takes care of what's happening between the handle and the core when you need an attachment piece, as well as the binding for it. And then the overlay is the outermost piece that goes on top of that. Once you get to the end of that, you have the handle, you have the transition, you have the thong, which is the flexible part of the whip that is braided. And then the unbraided portion is known as the fall. So then the fall has various different lengths. I really want to encourage people who are getting into whip cracking to tune their own falls. I know a lot of people that get a whip coming from a whip manufacturer and they don't realize that they need to tune it. So like probably the most common thing I see when I go and look at scenes that people are doing, I'll notice they have like a really, really long fall and I'll be like, why are you using that? And like, that's how it came. It's like, I can do one quick thing that'll completely change how your whip sounds and feels. And I just take that fall, a little bit of math, cut it to where it needs it, melt the end, tie a new popper, have them playing like, oh my God, it seems so much better. Like, yeah, tune your falls. That's all I want to say for that is actually tune your falls. Because you can't make a fall longer, right? Because you're using scissors to cut it, but you can always just cut it a little shorter. And then you have the popper or the cracker, which is a little fluffy, well, it's a stringy bit, but then that has a little fluffy bit at the bottom, which is what actually ends up making the sound, or rather it's what's pulling the pocket of air with it and then compressing the air in
Right.
front of it to create the bow shock once it exceeds the speed of sound. Those are like all the main components. There's a bunch of details in there, but I feel like I'm already at like a 5-minute answer.
No, you're good. I mean, that's a wonderful overview and a lot more in depth than I was thinking. Because in my mind, someone who knows nothing about whips, I'm like, okay, handle, main whip part, little thing at the end.
Yeah,
Sometimes.
that's the primary thing, but I make a lot of whips, so like I take a lot of design consideration. I'm like, what is the core things that is one step above the, you know, there's a pointy end and a non-pointy end.
Of course, yeah. No, I appreciate that level of depth. That's why I asked the question. Thank you for that. I
Welcome.
really appreciate that. It's fascinating to understand the construction of stuff like this because each little component that you mentioned is something that could be optimized and customized for its purpose.
Absolutely.
Minute little details at tailoring each of these little things can make a massive impact when you look at the culmination of all of that at the end.
Oh yeah, the mass taper, the smoothness, the tension, the directionality of the tension, how much belly, how much spine you want to put into it, the profile, the mass, the stiffness, the balance point. So a couple things that I do in my whips that not a lot of other people is like I actually put weights in certain locations to move the weight either one way or another, or I use like really long handles that are carbon fiber and hollow. So like there's nothing. I don't have a core inside my handle portion to make this super, super light. And then I'll have like a steel slug in there on this side. So now the balance point is now, instead of just like being in the middle, like it's all the way back here. So it puts it in my hand. So like for records that are the most number of cracks in a minute of some kind, I don't have to worry about torque as much. So like think about if you grab like a sledgehammer from here, it's really hard to move that sledgehammer back and forth versus if you put that sledgehammer in your hand, it's a lot easier. So like counterintuitive wise, if you grab something that is a long extended moment arm and you actually want to be able to lift it easier, you can't take mass away from something that you've already made, but you can add to it. By adding mass over here in terms of a long moment arm, it actually makes it easier to twist, which is like counterintuitive for a lot of people because you're adding mass to make it easier to move. But that's the difference between like just moving a physical mass in a linear manner versus trying to rotate it in a rotational manner. It actually helps to reduce the torque and it's easier to lift something. So playing with where you place like balance points or stiffnesses or center of mass when you're juggling whips, like all those like really come into play to optimizing them.
All of these physics things are coming back to me: moment arms, torics,
Yeah,
force diagrams.
I deal with this on a regular basis. It's maybe a bit in the weeds for some people.
You are completely fine. I guess my next question on that topic is, let's say someone wants to get into whips. They have, let's say, $200 and they want a general purpose whip. They have no idea the direction that they want to go. What's some advice that you can give for them?
$200 is rather generous. Most people, when they get into whips, they're thinking like they're 50, $60, right? So they go on
Oh, okay.
Amazon and they get
Sure.
like a cowhide whip they find online. And it's like, oh, I can't really get this to crack. So like if you're committed to the journey and you know you're committed to the journey, go ahead and get a decent, nice nylon bullwhip, like in that price range, like the $200 price range. Because if you start with a $50 whip, like you can learn on it, but it's going to be difficult. Um, and if you're not fully committed, don't like go try a friend's out, right? Like go to a flow festival, go to a class, go
Mhm.
to whip meetups, go to LA WhipCon so that you get to go play with them, and therefore you don't have to spend money up front to know what you like. And then evolution, your desires are going to change over time. So then you're going to be like, oh, do I want a longer whip or shorter whip? Lighter or heavier? Do I want something that's more dynamic and flexible or something that's like more powerful and stiff? Those are all going to change.
I said $200 because one, I think I'm so out of touch of how much they cost, just because I have photography
Yeah,
as
you're
a
like,
background,
my
so everything
base
starts at
camera
like $500 anyway.
my base
But
camera
yeah,
body for this full frame or medium frame cameras is a couple $1,000. When most people, when you're like hobby, it's like, yeah, I bought like this $5 Rubik's Cube. And you're like, oh yeah, there's a significant difference between it's like guitars, right? You can find a $20 pawn shop guitar. It's not gonna sound the best, and then you can go get like if we're staying in strings, like violins, Stradivariuses in the millions, and you're like, okay, cool.
yep, yep.
Let's find out where it's gonna be. And I would say for beginners, um, if it's your first whip, I'm pretty comfortable with people spending about $100 on their first whip. You're not gonna spend $100 on your first camera.
On that note of the price disparities and qualities of whips, how much does skill play a factor? Because if you have like I don't know, a person who's been playing guitar for 20 years and they pick up a $50 pawn shop guitar, they can make it sound pretty
Yeah,
good to a
absolutely.
degree. Does the same principle hold true for whips and the ability to execute with them?
I think it's gonna be more on your ear than it's going to be on your let me rephrase this answer. Um, the disparity is usually not for the person, it's for the audience, right?
Okay.
Because for, say, music, like the reason a $50 guitar will sound fine for most people when they hear like a guitarist play is because they're not going to hear the timbre between a guitar, a $500 guitar, and a $5,000 guitar, right? Like they're going to have some in there, but they're really concentrating more on like the complexity of the music. While if it's the same person in the same song, they're both playing Pachelbel's canon, like then the instrument matters, right? If we're both going to go to a somewhere like an ocean and take a picture with a cell phone versus like an old 35 millimeter versus like a crop sensor, a full frame, like you're gonna capture more light and be able to do more and more color gradient when you have like the raw version with like a D4 compared to somebody shooting with
Yeah.
like an old Sony or something like that. And you're like, okay,
Yeah.
now what they're seeing is not necessarily skill because you can set up the same shots. Uh, a lot of that comes down to kind of personal desires with that as well. Like if I want to do a show and I'm doing targeting, I want to start using targeting whips, in which case now that skill becomes much more apparent. But like if people want to just see you crack a whip, it doesn't really matter. So there's a bunch of different aspects there that comes in. And I would say for the average person, they're not going to be able to tell the difference between like $100 whip or $1,000 whip, but for someone using it, it's gonna be significantly easier to learn.
Okay, I think that's a wonderful explanation because you're right. There, it is the difference between the audience and the people watching the act versus the performer and the person actually doing the thing and how it feels for them.
Mhm.
I really like that
Thank
answer.
you.
Okay, so moving on from I guess the equipment for whip performances, what are some of the design considerations for putting together an engaging performance?
Oh, I get this question a lot. The area
Yeah.
that I'm getting this question about the most is actually in magic. We have a bunch of
Okay.
magic conversations that happen about how we want to develop our productions and whatnot. And as a personal pet peeve, I don't think a lot of people put in logistics into their performance considerations. So I'm going to Magi Fest next weekend, which is a Vanishing Incorporated event. So I encourage people to go there. Also, a co-director for Mystify Magic Festival that's happening out in LA. So I'm gonna, sorry, not LA. Supposed to be in LA, Las Vegas. So I want to make a quick plug for those. And I think one thing the magic realm really, really does is kind of trying to figure out how things are going to work together because there's so many more intricacies that get things to work together in terms of where things need to be placed so that um, it facilitates the art more. With like fire productions, if you have a lot of props, like where you place it is not as important as it would be like for magic because there's going to be some type of concealment or transposition that will occur. But like, I really want people to understand like where you go, like pick up a fire prop, where you go set it down for photography and videography, lighting. Like so many people concentrate on, hey, what type of camera do you have? And not like, how did you light it? Because you can get a phone camera to look phenomenal if you use the right lighting and vice versa. I can make a really nice camera look like crap if I'm shooting it in low light conditions, front lit directly up and above me. And you're just like, oh, or like if you put light directly underneath somebody's face, like that's the scary picture everybody sees. You're like,
Yeah, I
why
get
do I
that. Yeah.
look so gaunt? And you're like, yeah, in my personal opinion, when I think of like photography and a photographer, I think more of a lighting expert, right? My main goal as a photographer, like personally, is get the lighting beautifully set up so that I can capture that light. The photo is just the end result of how I want to have that composition and lighting
Yes.
and color and balance and placement. So for whip cracks in my shows, for me, the whips are kind of more of a medium. And what I want to develop is the emotional journey that somebody is going to go on. So it's that story, right? You don't need a pair of whips to entertain somebody. Like comedians and speakers exist. So do mimes. They don't even get to use their words. It's purely body language. I highly, highly, highly recommend. I know we make fun of mimes so much, but probably the best classes I have ever taken were mimes because their sole, like, their main point of these classes is how do you move your body in such a way that other people can see your emotions and the story you're trying to convey. Because like with acting and places where they get to see your face up close or even theater, you get words, you get to pull your face and emotions. So which is why mimes are like really exaggerated makeup on that. But the big thing is how your body movement and what your body language conveys is what pulls people into this idea. So, like, why am I setting this up? It doesn't matter whether it's with fire, with whips, with music, with a video camera. That's what people tend to get curious into. So for me, my kind of performing goal is to pull people's attention to me, and then I get to choose the medium I use, and most of the time that ends up being whips.
I think that is a fantastic
Thank you.
answer. Your explanation about cameras and lights and how all of that affects is one of the most refreshing things that I've heard in quite some time. Just because I'm a photographer, I understand this and I try to explain this to people, and it usually falls flat. So, thank you for understanding.
Yeah.
But that's such a wonderful breakdown of how to build up a performance, because you're right, stagecraft and those strong fundamentals is the foundation for how you build up an engaging show. And like you said, the tool that you use is just the implement that engages it, but all of the foundational elements are there from the start, and it's an entirely separate skill set that you need to work and develop.
Yeah, I was like, one of the ones that impressed me the most was basically you have to so it's a showcase style class where like everybody's coming up and you're like, you're not allowed to talk, you don't have music, and you're just like, engage people with your body language. Get people to applaud. Like, how do you get somebody to applaud if you don't get to use your words, you don't get to use music? You're just like, get people to applaud. And you realize if you just kind of sit there and freeze, no one's gonna like pay attention to you. You're like, oh God, I'm freezing up. But just being like, you can just be like, hey, yeah, just
Yeah.
like, give it to me. Or like people just want to applaud. If you just start applauding, you're like, okay, that's really obvious when you say it out loud, but it's not something that you're used to just being like, I'm just going to start applauding. Like, I love being the first person
Yeah.
to start clapping in a crowd because I can see people all of a sudden. Oh, when there's like that weird moment where it's like, we want to celebrate, but nobody knows what to do. If you just start clapping, everybody starts clapping with you. And I'm like, huh, we have a lot more control over this. So, like, my favorite opener is, it used to be an opener where it was like, I would end up like, I do something, the audience do something, I do something, audience does something, and I feel like that really, really captures the moment there. Or like competitions, like who can be louder with whips, like that really pulls audience engagement rather than the kind of old MC term of like, I don't hear you. Like when you can engage with the audience and make it either collaborative or competitive or funny, it really pulls them in more. So then that's what I really like using is, hey, this is the tool I happen to use to connect with people, to pull them in and make them applaud.
To build upon your answer, so I'm the regular photographer for a comedy dating show in Seattle called Fun and Flirty. And as I'm there, one of the things that we tell, one, the staff, and two, the people that get pulled onto the stage as guests, we tell them to have, laugh deep and heartily, big, bright smiles. If it's a moment where someone's supposed to be clapping, start the clapping, holler first,
Yes,
because it gives the crowd permission to engage and then do that thing.
100%. Yes, absolutely. This goes to at work too. Like, um, I learned that once I am more encouraging to my coworkers are more encouraging to each other. When I am more encouraging to my boss is more encouraging to me. Like, I myself can have an influence in my workplace to make it a better workplace. And like, we always talk about like how people don't quit jobs, they quit people, right? And I realized I am a people. Like, once again, it's one of those like really dumb things. You're like, I am a people. I can make the workplace better for my coworkers and for myself by, like, obviously there's not a huge amount of control, but there's enough influence for me to make it a more pleasant place, and then other people become more pleasant. I'm like, wow, why didn't anyone tell me this like 30 some years ago?
So it's actually funny. A closing tradition that we have on the show is the previous guest leaves a question for the current guest, not knowing who the current guest may be. And I think you just answered this, but the question that was actually left for you is, what is one small thing that you do in your daily life that makes the world a little bit better?
Use their name. When you meet somebody, just use their name. It's so simple. Um, I, the best examples I can always think of is going to restaurants and getting service. Like any customer
Mm.
service, some like the first thing you're supposed to do when you're on a call is, "Hi, my name is," right? "How may I help you?" right? Like
Yeah.
everybody, your first thing you're supposed to do is introduce yourself. If you're on somebody's customer service and you're trying to like um, I don't know, like improve the quality of your internet or your get a television show, I don't know, and you're just saying, "Oh, hi, Jason." Oh, just everybody loves the sound of their name. I when I started doing this, like not in a manipulative manner, just I wanted to start learning names better. So every time I went to a restaurant, now I do this every single time. When a waiter comes up to me or a waitress comes up to me, I just use their name, says, "Oh, hi Mary. Thank you so much, like thank you for getting the menus, just some small thing." I've never had bad service since. It's been like 20 years since I started doing this, and I have friends who
Yeah.
consistently like, "Why do I always get bad service?" Security guards, that is like one of my favorite things is when you go into a bar and you are able to use the bouncer's name, right? Like they just let you in. Right? Like, you
Yep.
have backup, you have security, whenever I go, like, on site on center, I try my best to know who the security people are, because then they're opening doors for you, they're just like, "Oh, how you've been?" You make their day better, not to mention you become friends with people better. Like, I'm not phenomenal with names, but just putting the effort to learn somebody's name and use it, it's just improved my life so much. It seems so small, but it's really changed my life in a different way.
I think that's wonderful. I mean, that's exactly how I like to live my life. One, I think, unlike video games, but in real life, charisma is one of the most overpowered traits you can possibly have. But it's those little things like remembering someone's name. Someone's name is the sweetest thing that they will ever hear. And it costs nothing, it's just that little bit of extra effort. And like you just described, it has such a massive impact on both the person hearing their name and your experience with the world around you.
Th
It's huge.
There was a piece of advice, and somebody, asked the question once, like, if you had 5 minutes to talk to, like, a supermodel or a celebrity or, it's like that, like, in a different language, like, say, "Oh, if you met this person and she's like a Spanish, supermodel celebrity person," it's like,
Hmm.
what phrase would you learn?" And it's like, I wouldn't learn a new phrase. I would learn how to pronounce her name correctly. Taking 5 minutes to do something as simple as roll an R, right, is I know it sound like it don't get me wrong, it's really, really difficult to first learn an R or just know, like, the accent in it, but if you put in effort, like, people really recognize that. Like, the first thing I do if I'm going to a foreign country is just learn how to say, "Hello, please, and thank you." And those 3 words will get you so far when you're just lost.
Yes, yes. Being polite, being kind to be around. Yeah, it's massive.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, April Jennifer Choi, this has been an absolute pleasure. Before we go, where would you like to draw people's attention to, and where can people find you?
Um, if you want to contact me, if you have questions, you can go to my websites, apriljenchoi.com, Jen with 2 N's. Um, I'm not performing, like, so I'm not, like, trying to guide people to things. If I were to try and plug anything, it's try and enjoy life. It's way shorter than you think. I don't think enough people are really understand how little time we have on this planet. And fortunately, the last few years have been very difficult for me in that regard. And I'm like, spend time with your family and your loved ones. I don't care how hard you put yourself at work. Like that's not getting you any more time with your kids. I really like the Tony Stark line of no amount of money has ever bought a second of time. I do really you can buy time
Yes.
back with like services and whatnot.
Of
Like
course. Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
concept of, like, $1,000,000 won't extend your life by like, extend the universe by a second. Like, obviously, you can start eating healthy and buying higher quality foods, and you'll live longer, and you'll have a higher lifespan, and, of course, you can, like, pay somebody to clean your house or mow your like in a
The
core
concept. Yeah.
fundamental sense, like, you can't buy physical well, not physical, but you can't buy time. So, like,
I
the
know what you mean.
principle
Yeah.
is there. There's a lot of corollaries, but I really try to now think of it like I am not going to be able to extend my life in a significant sense by the amount of money I have, right? Obviously, money matters. I wanna make sure there's a bunch of nuances to this, but its core value, like, I want to guide people to valuing their time. And since I'm no longer performing and trying to plug myself as a performer, I would rather see people enjoy their life than to go hunt me down on social media.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice, and that's something that I try to live, myself as well. Like, I spend a lot of time playing video games, more than I really should, and I take a look at this time like, okay, maybe if I just cut back by a couple of hours each week, and I use that to, call my dad or spend time with my siblings on like a voice chat. It's time much, much better spent, and I never regret it.
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, I really appreciate this conversation. I learned so much about whips and both the fluid dynamics behind them and how they're created and all of that. Thank you for your world-class expertise, the insights into, the Guinness World Record process, your own personal life. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you so much, Jason. It was a pleasure being on the show.
Cheers.